There's a place the Bureau of Prisons doesn't advertise, a place so violent that even guards called it the dungeon. A prison where gang leaders ordered hits through the walls, where homemade weapons were as common as toothbrushes, and where some inmates refused to leave solitary because the main yard was a death sentence. Welcome to USP Lewisburg, the deadliest penitentiary in modern U.S. history. Before we step inside the white walls of Lewisburg, the place inmates nicknamed the Big House of Pain, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This channel brings you real, verified stories from America's most dangerous prisons. If you want more true crime documentaries based on facts, not fiction, you're in the right place. Now, let's go inside. USP Lewisburg sits quietly in the small Pennsylvania town of Lewisburg, surrounded by peaceful fields, quiet roads, and rolling hills that make it look like an ordinary federal institution. But for decades, behind those stark white walls, everyday life operated under a level of violence unmatched by any other federal penitentiary. Lewisburg wasn't born to be a slaughterhouse, but it became one. Opened in 1932, Lewisburg was originally meant to house ordinary federal offenders, bank robbers, bootleggers, mobsters, and the occasional tax evader. But as the federal prison population exploded in the 1980s and 1990s, driven by drug wars, cartel expansion, and the rise of hyper-violent street gangs, the Bureau of Prisons slowly transformed Lewisburg into something far darker, a punishment ground for America's most uncontrollable inmates. By 2009, Lewisburg officially became a Special Management Unit, SMU, a designation that instantly changed its reputation. The SMU wasn't like a normal prison wing. It was a warehouse for inmates considered too violent, too unpredictable, or too deeply embedded in gang structures to mix with the general population. And inside the SMU, Lewisburg developed a system that journalists later described as an incubator for violence. Cells built for one man held two. Inmates were shackled during movement, hands, waist, feet. Guards controlled every inch of the hallway with steel doors and mesh fencing. But the most infamous policy? The chaining of cellmates together. In Lewisburg's SMU, two inmates could be housed together in a cell barely the size of a bathroom, even if they belonged to rival gangs or had requested separation for their safety. Multiple lawsuits later confirmed that some inmates begged for transfer, reporting they were forced to live beside people who had threatened to kill them. Several didn't make it out alive. The prison became a swirling battlefield of gang rivalries. The Aryan Brotherhood. 13. The DC Blacks. The Mexican Mafia. Bloods and Crips factions. Independent prison warriors who fought anyone. The BOP's official stance was always the same. Lewisburg was secure, controlled, and operating within regulations. But inside, inmates described a world where the line between survival and death was measured in inches, and in the reflexes of the man chained in the bunk next to you. One former Lewisburg correctional officer, interviewed anonymously, described the place with chilling accuracy. Lewisburg wasn't a prison. It was a pressure cooker. Everybody, inmates and staff, lived one decision away from disaster. He wasn't exaggerating. The numbers backed him up. Between 2009 and 2017, Lewisburg recorded hundreds of stabbings, slashings, assaults, and near-fatal attacks, many of which occurred inside cells where two inmates fought in close quarters with homemade weapons carved from razors or metal scraps. Reporters from NPR and the Marshall Project later uncovered case files showing inmates who left Lewisburg with missing eyes, broken jaws, fractured skulls, and stab wounds so deep the autopsy reports described them as delivered with extreme force. But the violence wasn't random, not in a place like this. Lewisburg had rules. Its gangs had hierarchies. And to understand the deadliest battles inside the white prison, you must first understand the codes that ran it, codes whispered through vents, taps, and hand signs, long before the first attack ever happened. And that takes us to the man many inmates believed ran Lewisburg's underground operations, even from solitary confinement. Inside Lewisburg, every inmate had a reputation, but only a few had power. And among them was one man the others whispered about, even when he wasn't anywhere near the unit. His name appears in real federal case files, buried between pages of sealed testimony and gang activity reports. An inmate known for orchestrating hits with nothing more than a sharpened pencil, a piece of string, and a network of followers loyal enough to spill blood on command. His name was Terrence T. Blade Graham, a ranking member of the DC Blacks, one of the most feared prison organizations in the federal system. T. Blade wasn't the biggest or the loudest, or even the most physically intimidating man in Lewisburg. But he had something far more dangerous. He understood the prison better than the staff did. By the time he arrived at Lewisburg in the early 2010s, He had already survived stabbings in USP Pollock, lockdown riots in USP Beaumont, and political wars inside USP Atlanta between rival factions. He came into Lewisburg not as a victim, but as someone the gangs instantly respected. And here's what makes Lewisburg different from any other violent prison in America. Even inside solitary, influential inmates could control entire units. Because Lewisburg had a communication system the Bureau of Prisons could never fully kill, a system built from decades of inmate creativity, desperation, and raw survival instinct. Inside Lewisburg, every cell vent was a telephone. Every shower drain was a message relay. Every meal tray crack became a pipeline for intel. And the man who mastered all of that was T-Blade. The Vent Network. Most prisons across the U.S. eventually redesigned their ventilation systems so inmates couldn't communicate between cells. But Lewisburg, built in 1932, still had its original ductwork. That meant a whisper in one cell could echo through 3, sometimes 4 rooms down. Inmates passed intel like Morse code. Short taps, long taps, pauses. Sometimes full conversations traveled through the metal tunnels. Former prisoners told investigators that T-Blade ran the vent line, like a switchboard operator, receiving messages, giving orders, coordinating movement. He learned which guards were on duty on each shift, who delivered commissary, which cell doors jammed, which inmates were refusing cellmates, and most importantly, which rival gangs were trying to move on his people. It wasn't long before Lewisburg staff realized something terrifying. When violence happened on the tier, T-Blade already knew it hours before they did. The Lewisburg Shuffle. This is where the prison became a battlefield. Inside the SMU, inmates were constantly shuffled into new cells, sometimes daily, sometimes weekly, sometimes in direct conflict with their own safety requests. Officials said the intent was to break gang structure. But in reality, the system created a perfect storm. A Crip would suddenly be paired with a Blood, a white supremacist with a Latino gang member, a Sereno with an MS-13 soldier. Cellmate pairings turned into forced Gladiator matches. And T-Blade? He used the shuffle as a weapon. Whenever the staff moved someone new onto his tier, he immediately tapped into the vent system to figure out the inmates' gang history, beefs, and whether they were a threat. If they were dangerous, his crew would warn vulnerable cellmates to stay alert. If the newcomer was an enemy, things escalated. In a federal interview later leaked to reporters, one former Lewisburg inmate described the atmosphere as, "You don't sleep your first 48 hours. You sit on the toilet with your shoes on. You don't turn your back. You wait. Because either you're gonna strike or he is." This wasn't exaggeration. Lewisburg's files document more two-man cell assaults than any other modern U.S. penitentiary. Some lasted minutes. Some lasted hours. Some didn't stop until one inmate stopped moving. And many of those attacks were orchestrated by gang shot callers who weren't even on the same tier. The cell wars begin. By 2013, Lewisburg had reached a tipping point. Assaults were happening weekly. Weapons were being found hidden in light fixtures, vents, and mattress seams. Guards were being injured pulling bodies apart. And T-Blade was rising, not because he wanted to run Lewisburg, but because Lewisburg created the perfect environment for men like him. He didn't need a cell phone. He didn't need money. He didn't need favors from corrupt officers. All he needed was a network of inmates trapped in tiny cells with enemies, all searching for protection or revenge. Protection demanded loyalty. Loyalty created structure. Structure created power. And in a place where men bled in silence, the one who could promise, "I got you," became king. But Lewisburg wasn't controlled by just one man. There were others, rival leaders carving out influence from the shadows, plotting moves of their own. And one of them was about to challenge T-Blade in a way that would reshape the entire SMU. If T-Blade controlled Lewisburg through the vents, his rival controlled it through fear, loud, raw, and physical. His name carried weight across the federal system long before he ever stepped foot in Pennsylvania. Rafael El Diablo Mendez, a known shot caller with deep ties to MS-13. Unlike T-Blade, who preferred strategy and whispers, El Diablo ruled with spectacle. Every move he made was meant to send a message, not just to his enemies but to his own people. And when word spread that the Bureau of Prisons was transferring him from USP Hazleton to Lewisburg's SMU, the entire prison braced for impact. The arrival of El Diablo. He came in shackled from wrist to ankle, escorted by a 6-man tactical team. His arrival wasn't quiet. Inmates later said they could hear the metallic clinking of his chains echoing down the corridor before they ever saw him. What made El Diablo so feared wasn't just his body count or his reputation for violence. It was the way he turned every prison he entered into a political chessboard. He wasn't a mindless soldier. He was a tactician, the kind who used brutality as a negotiation tool. USP Lewisburg soon learned that firsthand. A clash of empires inside two-man cells. Remember, Lewisburg's SMU constantly shuffled inmates. Two-man cells. No separation by gang. No compatible pairing system that protected rival factions. This meant one thing. If a new shot caller arrived, the first battles wouldn't happen in the yard, they'd happen in the cells. And El Diablo came in with a mission: expand MS-13's influence inside the SMU. To do that, he needed to take control of the Vent line, the same network T-Blade already dominated. But neither man could openly declare war. Lewisburg wasn't built for open warfare. It was built for quiet violence. Sneak attacks, cell ambushes, improvised weapons hidden inside rolled-up socks, sharpened metal toothbrushes tucked into mattress corners. To control the prison, each man had to control the flow of information. The first move: silence the vents. 2 days after El Diablo arrived, guards were called to respond to a commotion on C range: angry banging, muffled shouting, the sound of metal hitting metal. They found an MS-13 soldier smashing the inside of his vent with a broken broom handle. He wasn't trying to escape. He was trying to block airflow. Block sound. El Diablo's men were deliberately destroying the vent connections between certain cells to cut off T-Blade's communication network. It was crude, risky, and guaranteed to draw disciplinary write-ups. But it worked. The next morning, T-Blade tried to send coded taps through the grids. For the first time since he'd risen to power at Lewisburg, the vents didn't answer back. Tension turns toxic. Denied his communication lines, T-Blade was forced to rely on slower methods. Meal tray notes known as kites, and the shower drain whisper chain. But El Diablo anticipated that. His soldiers monitored the showers, watched who passed what, and disrupted any indirect contact they could identify. Lewisburg turned into a pressure cooker. One wrong move and the entire SMU could erupt. Guards felt it too, the sudden hush that settled over the tiers, the way inmates watched each other through the cracks in their doors, the way rival factions stopped yelling insults and instead went dead silent. Old-school inmates said you could always tell when violence was about to explode inside Lewisburg. The noise dropped to 0. And the tension climbed to 100. The two-man cell incident that made national news. The flashpoint came less than 2 weeks after El Diablo arrived. It started in a cell on D range, a tiny concrete room that had already seen multiple assaults over the years. In that room, staff housed an MS-13 loyalist named Carlos Spider Herrera with a quiet, soft-spoken independent inmate named Marcus Reed. Reed had no gang affiliation, no enemies, no leadership role. He wasn't even supposed to be in the SMU. He'd been transferred for refusing orders at another prison, not for violence. But cellmates weren't chosen with safety in mind. They were chosen by the shuffle. Early that morning, T-Blade managed to get a message to Reed through the vent gaps that hadn't been sealed yet: "Don't trust your cellie. Watch him." Reed didn't understand why. He'd never met Spider before. But El Diablo had. And Spider had been given orders. At 5:32 a.m., before breakfast trays arrived, Spider launched a brutal attack with a weapon carved from a melted toothbrush and a razor blade. Reed fought back, screaming for help, but the concrete walls swallowed his voice. By the time officers arrived, Reed had been stabbed multiple times: chest, arms, face, and Spider was kneeling calmly against the back wall, his hands covered in blood. What made the attack national news wasn't the brutality. Lewisburg had seen brutality before. It was the note Spider had hidden under his mattress. A message signed with MS-13 markings, declaring the start of a cleansing inside Lewisburg. T-Blade learned about the attack in minutes. El Diablo knew he'd landed the first blow. And the entire SMU realized something terrifying. This wasn't a random attack. This was a declaration of war. The white walls would soon run red. Reed survived, barely, but the incident triggered a chain reaction. Within 24 hours, tension spiraled into threats, coded messages, and retaliatory plans whispered through every remaining vent line. Lewisburg wasn't just dangerous anymore. It was teetering on the edge of a full-scale gang conflict. And neither T-Blade nor El Diablo had any intention of backing down. The deadliest days of USP Lewisburg were still ahead. Violence in American prisons is nothing new, but what happened the week after Spider attacked Marcus Reed was different. Journalists later referred to it as the 7 days of hell. Guards who worked the units during that time still described those shifts as the most dangerous of their entire careers. And for the inmates living inside the SMU, It felt like the walls themselves were tightening, like Lewisburg had become a battlefield sealed inside concrete. The first signs of the war came at dawn on Monday. Day 1, the first retaliation. On C Range, where T-Blade's influence was strongest, an MS-13 soldier named Mijo was assigned a new cellmate, a DC Blacks loyalist named Anton Black Ice Morris. The pairing wasn't accidental. Staff later said the classification paperwork was routine, but inmates believed otherwise. Pairing rival gang members inside Lewisburg's SMU was like lighting a match in a room full of gasoline. As soon as the door slid shut, the shouting began. It echoed down the hallway, curses, gang signs thrown through the air, threats layered on top of threats. Guards ignored it. Arguments were background noise inside Lewisburg. But when the yelling stopped abruptly, everyone on the tier knew what that meant. A minute of silence. Then came the banging, fists, feet, metal on concrete. Officers rushed in, but the assault was over by the time the door cracked open. Mijo had been knocked unconscious. A makeshift shank made from a torn-off metal vent plate had been hidden under the mattress. Black ice didn't kill him. But that wasn't the goal. This was a message. The DC Blacks would not be intimidated. This act kicked off the first domino in a chain that no one in Lewisburg could stop. Day 2, the Whisper Riots. On Tuesday, something strange happened. The entire SMU went quiet. Not normal quiet, unnatural quiet. Guards said they could walk the whole tier and hear nothing but the hum of lights and distant footsteps. No yelling. No vent tapping. No banging on doors. Nothing. The silence freaked everyone out. Later inmates revealed why. T-Blade and his lieutenants had ordered what became known as a whisper lockdown, a coordinated freeze across all ranges to prepare for retaliatory attacks. They used the remaining open vents to relay orders. Save your energy. No noise. Wait for instruction. Guards felt the tension but didn't know why. By midnight, the silence was suffocating. A rookie officer later told reporters. That night felt like the building was holding its breath. You knew something was coming. You just didn't know when. Day 3, the first shank found in a guard's blind spot. Wednesday morning brought the first real shock. During a routine cell search, officers found a weapon tucked deep inside a light fixture, a 6-inch shank sharpened to a needlepoint. But that wasn't the disturbing part. The weapon was wrapped in a note. A manifest. A list of 3 inmate names. All MS-13. All marked for elimination. The handwriting matched a DC Blacks associate. It was clear. Retaliation wasn't over. The war was escalating. Officers alerted supervisors. Supervisors alerted the warden. But inside Lewisburg, a piece of paper doesn't stop bloodshed. A shank found only means 10 more are hidden. Day 4, the Vent Siren. Thursday is the day Lewisburg staff say the prison changed forever. Just after breakfast trays were delivered, inmates on A Range heard something unexpected through the vents. Not tapping, not whispering, but a steady banging rhythm. Clank, 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 pause, clank, 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 over and over. It didn't sound like a message, it sounded like a warning siren. Inmates called it the Vent Siren. A coded alert that attacks were about to start across the SMU. And they did. Within an hour, 2 separate 2-man cell assaults broke out. On one tier, a Sereno slashed his cellmate during a dispute sparked by MS-13 orders. On another, a Bloods member tried to choke an Aryan Brotherhood affiliate after discovering the man was paid to target him during showers. It wasn't coordinated warfare yet, not fully, but the chaos was spreading like wildfire. Inmates later said the Vent Siren was ordered by none other than T-Blade himself. It was meant to unify the tiers under one truth. This is war now. Nobody is safe. Day 5, Lewisburg locks down, and still falls apart. By Friday morning, staff had seen enough. The warden ordered a full, immediate lockdown. No shower time. No recreation. No library. No movement. No cell transfers. The problem? Lockdowns don't work in Lewisburg's SMU. Not when every cell is already a 2-man box filled with tension. The violence didn't stop. It simply got quieter, and more deliberate. That afternoon, officers found a Bloods member unconscious in his cell, his face swollen from repeated blows. His cellmate claimed they were horsing around, but the injuries told a different story. Then, at 11:47 p.m., the worst attack of the week happened. Day 6, the assault that broke the tier. On Saturday, the tier erupted. An MS-13 soldier named Gatto was paired with a young Crip named Darnell Tate, not affiliated with any major prison politics. Tate had begged staff not to house him with Gatto. His file contained clear warnings about incompatibility. He was ignored. At lights out, Gatto brutally attacked Tate using a shank made from melted plastic trays, a kind of weapon Lewisburg inmates were infamous for creating. The assault lasted nearly 20 minutes. Other inmates screamed, banged on doors, kicked, shouted at guards. But the screams were muffled by concrete. When officers finally forced the cell open, Tate was barely breathing. He died later at an outside hospital. The death sent shockwaves through the SMU. Inmates on the tier openly blamed the staff. One shouted through the vent system, "This blood is on y'all. You put him in there." For the first time in years, Lewisburg guards admitted they'd lost control. Day 7, the warden's midnight meeting. On Sunday at 2:13 a.m., supervisors held an emergency meeting with tactical officers. They had two options: flood the SMU with force, extraction teams and restraints. Try to negotiate with gang shot callers through inmate channels. Negotiating with inmates is against BOP policy. But Lewisburg wasn't functioning under normal policy anymore. And the only two men with enough influence to calm the tears were T-Blade and El Diablo. The warden hated the idea. Supervisors hated the idea. But the reality was clear. If they didn't talk to the gang leaders, the violence would continue until more inmates ended up in body bags. And so, for the first time since the SMU was opened, Lewisburg officials attempted something unthinkable. They tried to broker peace inside the most violent federal prison in the country. But peace was not what they were going to get. Because T-Blade and El Diablo were already planning their next moves. Moves that would lead to the deadliest confrontation inside Lewisburg since the 1980s. For most prisons, negotiations are a last resort. For Lewisburg, they were practically unheard of. The SMU wasn't designed for compromise, it was designed for containment. But after a week of non-stop violence, a dead inmate, multiple near-fatal assaults, and growing tension across every tier, staff ran out of options. That's how, in the early hours of Monday morning, the warden and his supervisors found themselves inside a cramped operations room, staring at a plan that no one wanted to approve. They were going to communicate with the two most dangerous inmates in the building. The decision no one wanted to sign. "Sir, we can't open their doors," one lieutenant said. "We're not," the warden replied. "We're passing messages." The plan was simple in theory. Use the officers trusted with meal delivery to slide written messages under the doors of T-Blade and El Diablo. The messages wouldn't reveal tactics, promises, or concessions. Just one question: what will it take to stop the violence? The warden wasn't naive. He didn't expect a truce. He expected leverage, something to calm the tears long enough to reassign inmates, conduct searches, and seize weapons. But the moment they decided to contact both men, they made a fatal mistake. They assumed T-Blade and El Diablo were interested in peace. They weren't. They were interested in power. The message reaches T-Blade. At 3:42 a.m., a correctional officer slid the message under T-Blade's door. He read it once, then again. Then he smiled, not the grin of a man amused but the grin of someone who sees opportunity. T-Blade wasn't stupid. He knew what this meant. The administration was scared. They were losing control. And when a prison loses control, the inmates gain it. He tapped on his vent, summoning two of his lieutenants in nearby cells. Using the faint echo chambers, he relayed instructions. "We stall. We push them. Let the pressure build. Don't stop anything until I say." To T-Blade, the warden's message wasn't a peace offering. It was an admission of weakness. And weakness was something a shot caller could turn into dominance. The message reaches El Diablo. The officer who delivered El Diablo's message hesitated. Even in solitary, El Diablo radiated danger. When he slid the note under the door, El Diablo crouched to the floor slowly, like a predator examining prey. He read the message, stood up, and laughed, a cold, sharp laugh that made the officer instinctively step back. El Diablo didn't want peace either. But unlike T-Blade, who saw the situation as leverage, El Diablo saw it as an opening for something far bigger. A chance to cripple the DC Blacks' influence inside Lewisburg once and for all. El Diablo immediately went to work. He used his own communication networks, the drain system, the shower pipes, coded coughing patterns through the vents, to relay one order: act calm. Act compliant. Let them think we're done. This wasn't surrender. This was camouflage. Amidst 13 soldiers across 3 tiers suddenly stopped yelling, stopped threatening rivals, stopped banging on doors. Guards noticed. Supervisors noticed. And T-Blade noticed. The silence that frightened everyone. By noon that day the SMU was disturbingly peaceful. The warden believed negotiation might actually be working. But Lewisburg veterans, both staff and inmates, knew better. Silence in that place wasn't peace. Silence was a countdown. T-Blade recognized the pattern immediately. He realized El Diablo was buying time, but for what? A coordinated attack? A decoy? A hit on one of his lieutenants? The uncertainty angered him. And when T-Blade got angry, the entire tier felt it. T-Blade's countermove. That night, T-Blade sent out a message of his own. Shut it down. All tiers. Nobody moves without my word. It was a lockdown within a lockdown, a show of dominance. Inmates aligned with the DC Blacks, Bloods, and several independent groups obeyed instantly. No talking. No vent tapping. No movement. Only silence, tense, suffocating, ready to explode silence. T-Blade was challenging El Diablo's calm with his own. El Diablo didn't respond. He didn't need to. Because by then his plan was already in motion. The setup no one saw coming. It started around 5:15 a.m. Guards were doing morning rounds when they saw something unusual. Gatto, the MS-13 soldier who killed Darnell Tate, was sitting calmly in his cell, reading a Bible. Gatto was many things. Religious was not one of them. The officers chalked it up to post-incident remorse. They had no idea it was a signal. Minutes later, another MS-13 member requested a medical form. Another asked for a razor. Another politely asked for a second blanket. Small requests. Normal requests. Routine requests. Too routine. And in Lewisburg, routine can be a disguise. The spark hits the powder. At 6:03 a.m. it happened. A guard walking past B-range heard a single sharp metallic sound, a clank against a door. He paused. Another clank. Then three in quick succession. The exact rhythm MS-13 used as a go order. Before the officer could react, violence erupted. 3 cells exploded simultaneously. In one, an MS-13 soldier ambushed a DC Blacks member with a shank carved from a food tray. In another, 2 rivals exploded into a fistfight so brutal the door shook. In the third, a gang enforcer used his handcuffs, obtained during a previous escort, as brass knuckles. The tier went wild. Screams. Banging. Weapons flashing under the dim lights. It was an orchestrated assault, perfectly timed, perfectly executed, and devastatingly fast. Guards called Mayday. Alarms blared. Extraction teams rushed in with shields. And while chaos tore through the SMU, one inmate sat quietly in his solitary cell. El Diablo. He didn't need to participate. He'd already won the first phase. T-Blade's fury turns deadly. When T-Blade learned what happened, something inside him snapped. This wasn't just an attack. It was humiliation. A strategic slap in the face. He immediately ordered retaliation. Not tomorrow. Not later. No. He sent a vent message that echoed through the ductwork like a war horn. Kill squads. All ranges. Take back the block. In minutes, Lewisburg was plunged into the most violent day in its SMU history. Weapons flashed. Doors shook. Inmates screamed through vents for reinforcements. Guards couldn't keep up. Extraction teams were overwhelmed. And smack in the middle of it all were the 2 men responsible. T-Blade. And El Diablo. The war for Lewisburg had officially begun. And the worst was still ahead. There are days in prison history that get whispered about for years. Days so violent that even the hardest inmates lower their voices when they mention them. For USP Lewisburg, that day was Wednesday, 6:18 a.m. The moment T-Blade's kill order echoed through the vents, the SMU transformed from a high-security unit into something no officer had ever faced before. A coordinated battlefield. The first wave hit C-range. The assaults began with terrifying precision. On C-range, where T-Blade's loyalists were concentrated, a Bloods member named Rondo attacked his cellmate, an MS-13 associate who had only been housed there for 48 hours. Rondo used a weapon crafted from metal ripped from a property box hinge, sharpened against the concrete floor until it glinted like a knife. He struck fast. 5 jabs to the ribs. 2 to the arm. 1 deep slash across the cheek. Guards sprinted toward the door as the assault unfolded, but Rondo backed away calmly when he heard the boots rushing down the tier. He dropped the weapon into his toilet and flushed 3 times, the standard signal that the shank was gone. The officers arrived seconds too late. This was the first confirmed attack of the day. It wouldn't be the last. B-range explodes next. Just minutes later, chaos erupted on B-range. This was El Diablo's territory. 3 inmates began attacking their cellmates simultaneously, using weapons hidden under mattresses in light fixtures and inside rolled-up socks. One inmate used a padlock inside a glove, a classic prison weapon called a lock-in-a-sock. The attacks were coordinated, calculated, unmistakably deliberate. The alarms blared through the entire SMU, a deafening high-pitched screech that meant officers down or tiers compromised. But Lewisburg was too big, too violent, too unstable. There weren't enough officers to respond to every assault at once. The officers are overwhelmed. When the CERT, Correctional Emergency Response Team, ran toward C range, they were intercepted by chaos unfolding on A range. 2 inmates had jammed their cell door using a ripped bedsheet, creating a delay that bought their allies time to assault another cellmate down the tier. It was a tactic Lewisburg officers had never seen before. Multiple distractions across different ranges designed to split the response teams. By the time officers forced their way onto the tier, they were met with a horrifying sight. Blood smeared across walls. Weapons clattering on concrete. A cell window fogged from the heat of a violent struggle inside. "This is out of control," one officer shouted into his radio. "We need backup now." Backup was coming, but slowly. Lewisburg wasn't built to handle a multi-tier riot inside a sealed SMU. The vents become a war drum. Just when it seemed like the violence might slow, something new happened. A deafening, rhythmic pounding shook the ventilation system. Not random noise. Signals. Every gang in Lewisburg had its own tapping pattern, a beat that meant move, strike, hold, or fall back. Now dozens of inmates were tapping at once. Clank, 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 pause, clank. Clank, 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 pause, clank. It echoed across all 3 floors of the SMU like a war drum. Officers froze. This was the moment they realized. The inmates weren't acting alone. They were acting together. In coordinated units. Lewisburg had never seen anything like it. T-Blade sends out his enforcers. T-Blade himself wasn't physically in a fight. He didn't have to be. He issued orders through the vents. Target the soldiers. Not the scraps. Cut off their arms and the body dies. In prison terms, soldiers meant the active fighters, the gang's muscle. Scraps were the low-level recruits, amateurs, or hangers-on. Across 2 ranges, DC Blacks and affiliated groups launched precision attacks against MS-13 enforcers, the heavy hitters who carried out El Diablo's work. On D range, a DC Blacks member ambushed an MS-13 soldier while he slept. On E range, another pair of inmates strangled an MS follower using a torn strip from a bedsheet twisted into a rope. Each attack was designed not to cause random violence, but to cripple El Diablo's military structure. El Diablo strikes back with brutality. El Diablo, sitting in solitary, wasn't watching the violence, but he could hear it. And he knew exactly what T-Blade was doing. He had no vent line to communicate through. T-Blade's men had blocked the closest access point. So he used a different method. He began kicking the back wall of his cell. To most people it would sound like random banging. But inmates knew better. Each slam was timed with mathematical precision. 2 long hits. 1 short hit. Pause. Repeat. The signal meant only one thing across gang networks. Kill on sight. No more warnings. No more intimidation. No more negotiation. El Diablo was unleashing his final phase. The doors jam trick. On A range, MS-13 soldiers began executing a trick invented years earlier in USP Atlanta, the doors jam trick. Using ripped bedsheet strips, they tied knots between the door hinges just before morning checks. When officers tried to open the door for safety rounds, the cloth jammed the mechanism. This bought attackers precious seconds to finish assaults before guards could enter. It worked. 2 inmates were critically injured before CERT teams cut through the fabric. Lewisburg slowly turns into a combat zone. At this point, 11 confirmed assaults. 4 critical injuries. 3 ranges compromised. Weapons found in nearly every cell search. Emergency staff exhausted and overwhelmed. The warden ordered modified full lockdown, a protocol only used when staff believe a riot could spread to the entire prison. But lockdown meant nothing. Every 2-man cell was a micro-battlefield. Every vent carried war signals. Every minute brought new violence. And then, just when it seemed the SMU couldn't possibly descend further, something happened that would change the entire course of the conflict. A message reaches T-Blade. A whisper through the vent. A quick, desperate message from a lookout on B range. They're coming for you. 2 cells up. They got a key. T-Blade froze. A key. Inside Lewisburg's SMU? Impossible. Unthinkable. Unheard of. Unless someone on the inside had given El Diablo access. Someone staff trusted. Someone who moved freely. And in that instant T-Blade understood. This wasn't just a gang war anymore. This was a setup. A betrayal. A conspiracy. And he knew exactly why. El Diablo wasn't trying to control Lewisburg. He was trying to eliminate T-Blade. Publicly. Brutally. Irreversibly. The ambush was coming. And T-Blade had minutes, maybe seconds, to respond. Lewisburg had reached its breaking point. And the deadliest confrontation of them all was about to ignite. The moment T-Blade heard those words, "They got a key," the entire architecture of the SMU seemed to tilt. Keys are sacred in prison. Their power. Their control. And they are never, under any circumstances, supposed to be in the hands of inmates. If even one key slips into the wrong hands, a prison can unravel in minutes. And Lewisburg? Lewisburg was already hanging by a thread. The impossible becomes possible. T-Blade pressed his ear to the vent, forcing himself to stay calm as the desperate whisper continued. 2 MS hitters. They got a copy. Tier officer ain't seen it gone yet. A copy? That meant someone had replicated a key, the kind that opened certain mechanical cell doors in older units. It wasn't supposed to be copyable. Not with modern metal. Not with the precision required. Unless it wasn't a full key at all. It could have been a shadow key, a primitive but effective tool used in some older federal prisons. A thin metal strip cut into the approximate shape of the locking plate. Shadow keys aren't perfect. They take time. They make noise. And they only work on certain doors. But if MS-13 had one? If they were patient enough? If they were quiet enough? They could pop a cell. And T-Blade had just been told his cell was the target. T-Blade makes his first move. He didn't panic. He didn't yell. He didn't start banging on the door like a desperate man. He did what a strategist does. He prepared. He tore his bedsheet into 2 thick strips and twisted them hard into a rope. He wrapped one around his knuckles. The other he tied tight around his forearm, a makeshift shield against blade attacks. Then he removed the one item every Lewisburg inmate relied on but rarely thought about. The metal rod inside his toothbrush. By rubbing the plastic handle against the concrete floor for years, inmates learned to heat it just enough to pull out the inner rod, a thin steel core that could be sharpened to a lethal point. T-Blade had his ready in seconds. He crouched near the door listening for footsteps. In the hallway 2 shadows move. The range was chaotic. Officers were stretched thin, responding to assault after assault. And in the middle of the storm 2 MS-13 enforcers, Lil Psycho and Beto, moved like ghosts. Both covered their hands with socks to avoid leaving prints. Both crouched low to avoid the vision lines of the small plexiglass windows on each door. Both were waiting for the noise level to spike, so guards wouldn't hear what they were doing. Lil Psycho produced the shadow key, a piece of metal filed from the inner ring of a mop bucket, carved with painstaking precision over weeks. It wasn't pretty, but it didn't have to be. It only had to turn far enough to catch the lock. They reached T-Blade's cell. Lil Psycho whispered, "Aura." Now, Beto scanned the tier. No officers in sight. Perfect. Lil Psycho slid the shadow key into the chamber. It scraped metal. A harsh grinding sound. Inside the cell, T-Blade froze. T-Blade knows he has seconds. There's a sound every long-term inmate recognizes. The metal-on-metal scrape of a key trying to catch a lock that isn't quite designed for it. It's unmistakable. And deadly. T-Blade moved silently to the side of the door, the blind spot. Anyone entering would expect him to be directly in front. That's where most inmates make their last mistake. But T-Blade wasn't most inmates. He waited. He listened. He counted the clicks. Click, 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 click. And then the most terrifying sound in the Lewisburg SMU. K-Chuck. The lock disengaged. The door was open. The ambush begins. The door slid just far enough for a hand to reach through. Beto shoved it hard, pushing it 2 feet wide. Lil Psycho stepped in first, swinging a melted plastic shank about 7 inches long. The blade glistened from being sharpened with toothpaste powder, a common prison technique. But he swung at empty air. T-Blade wasn't where he expected. He was already moving. He drove forward from the blind spot, slamming his shoulder into Lil Psycho's ribs. The MS soldier gasped, the air knocked out of him as they fell backward into the hallway. Beto surged forward, raising his weapon, but in the tight space he couldn't get a full swing. That's when T-Blade struck. He jabbed his sharpened toothbrush rod straight into Beto's forearm. Beto screamed, a raw, panicked sound that ricocheted down the tier. The vents erupt. The moment Beto screamed, the vents exploded with noise. Taps. Clanks. Shouts. Every inmate recognized the sound of an ambush. T-Blade wasn't just fighting for his life, he was fighting for control of Lewisburg. MS-13 soldiers on other tiers began pounding for backup. DC Blacks began shouting warnings and rallying allies. The air vibrated with panic and adrenaline. Officers hear the wrong thing. An officer 2 tiers down heard the scream, but he misinterpreted it as a fight inside a different cell. He called it in. Possible assault in D36. They were heading toward the wrong cell. T-Blade was on his own. The fight turns brutal. Lil Psycho recovered fast, faster than T-Blade expected. He lunged from the floor, stabbing wildly. The blade sliced T-Blade's forearm where the bedsheet rope didn't fully protect him. Blood spattered the wall. T-Blade gritted his teeth and countered with a backhand strike, catching Lil Psycho in the temple. The MS soldier stumbled. But Beto was back on his feet. He rushed T-Blade from behind, trying to hook his arm around T-Blade's throat in a chokehold. T-Blade reacted instantly. He drove his heel backward with full force, stomping hard on Beto's knee. There was a sickening pop. Beto collapsed screaming. Lil Psycho panicked. He lunged again, going for a fatal stab, throat level. T-Blade dodged just enough. The blade sliced his shoulder instead of his jugular. In one fluid motion, T-Blade slashed upward with his sharpened steel rod, carving a deep line across Lil Psycho's cheek. Lil Psycho stumbled back. Right into the line of sight of a guard rounding the corner. Officers arrive, too late to stop it. Stop. Stop right there. The officers saw. An open cell door. 2 MS-13 inmates on the ground. T-Blade covered in blood. Weapons everywhere. He hit the alarm. The tier lights turned red. Extraction teams flooded the hallway with shields and batons. The fight was over. But the consequences weren't. The mystery of the key deepens. Once the attackers were restrained, the search began. Officers found the shadow key, a second half-finished duplicate, a sketch of T-Blade's cell lockplate, and, most damning of all, a strip of metal that didn't come from inmate sources. It came from inside the prison. From staff equipment. The rumor spread instantly. Someone on the inside helped MS-13. And the name whispered through the SMU that morning wasn't an inmate. It was an officer. A real one. Someone who had access. Someone who had motive. Someone who may have been working with El Diablo for months. Lewisburg didn't just have a gang war. It had a mole. The deadliest chapter in the prison's history wasn't ending. It was just beginning. Lewisburg had always been violent. Always dangerous. Always unpredictable. But what happened after the ambush changed everything, because for the first time since the SMU opened in 2009, staff began whispering the one word no federal prison ever wants attached to its name. Compromised. A key, even a shadow copy, doesn't appear out of thin air. It must be traced, accounted for, investigated. But the metal used in the half-finished duplicate found outside T-Blade's cell told the real story. It wasn't mop bucket steel. It wasn't cafeteria steel. It wasn't bed frame steel. It was utility door steel, the exact type used on staff access maintenance hatches. Meaning someone with access to restricted areas had provided raw material to MS-13. Meaning someone with a badge. The internal panic begins. The moment the metal analysis came back, the warden held a confidential meeting with his assistant wardens, intelligence officers, and 2 senior lieutenants. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. Who had access to that panel? The warden asked. Only 4 staff members did. A maintenance foreman. A senior plumber. A facilities lieutenant. And a new correctional officer named Officer Diego Alvarez. Alvarez had only been at Lewisburg for 11 months. Young. Quiet. A bit too friendly with inmates according to some reports. But friendliness wasn't a crime. And no one, absolutely no one, wanted to consider that a staff member might be helping MS-13. Still, something about Alvarez bothered investigators. A pattern hidden in plain sight. The intelligence unit pulled his activity logs. And a disturbing pattern emerged. Every major MS-13 assault in the last 6 months occurred within 24 hours of Alvarez working that range. Coincidence? Maybe. Lewisburg was chaotic. Most officers witnessed violence daily. But Alvarez didn't just witness violence. He predicted it. More than once, he'd warned staff to watch that cell, or keep an eye on that inmate. Always just minutes before MS-13 soldiers committed an attack. Some officers believed he was observant. Others believed he was lucky. But now, it looked like he was informed. The Whisper Network confirms it. Inside the SMU, inmates noticed details staff didn't. Whispers traveled fast. Through vents. Through drain pipelines. Through meal trays. One inmate, a quiet older lifer named Ortega, sent a kite through the plumbing line to an officer he trusted. It said, "Check Alvarez. He talks through C-range doors. Diablo trusts him." The officer who received the message felt his stomach drop. If El Diablo trusted Alvarez. If Alvarez was communicating with tiers he had no business talking to. If inmates were noticing him too. Then this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was infiltration. The interrogation that changed everything. The next morning, Alvarez was escorted into the warden's conference room. He sat down calmly. No sweat. No panic. No shifty eyes. He looked like a man who had prepared for this moment. "Officer Alvarez," the warden began, "we need to ask about your activity during yesterday's incident." Alvarez shrugged. "Ask whatever you need, sir. I did my job." "We found metal that appears to match restricted maintenance panels," the warden continued. "Panels you were assigned to last week." Silence. Alvarez didn't flinch. The assistant warden leaned forward. "Is there anything you want to tell us?" Alvarez smiled, a small, almost polite smile. "No, sir," he said softly. "But if something happened on the tier, maybe you're asking the wrong people." It wasn't a confession. It was a warning. The search that exposed the truth. Investigators obtained permission to search Alvarez's locker. It took less than 5 minutes to find something that made seasoned federal officers go pale. A small metal file. A folded piece of blueprint paper. A list of inmate numbers, all MS-13. And the most incriminating item of all. A napkin with El Diablo's inmate number written on it. In federal prison, inmates aren't allowed to know staff numbers. And staff are never allowed to write down inmate numbers casually. This wasn't casual. This was communication. El Diablo's gambit revealed. While investigators scrambled, something else was happening inside the SMU. El Diablo was sitting on his bunk, smiling slightly. Because everything was working exactly as he planned. He didn't need to escape. He didn't need to dominate every range. He didn't even need to kill T-Blade directly. He needed exactly 2 things. A mole in staff ranks. Chaos so extreme that leadership would lose credibility. By proving an officer had compromised the prison, El Diablo struck a blow far deeper than any stabbing or brawl ever could. He was aiming at the entire structure of Lewisburg. The trust. The authority. The chain of command. Break the trust and the whole system collapses. And with that collapse, his gang's power would explode. But there was one problem. El Diablo had underestimated T-Blade. Because while investigators zeroed in on the mole, T-Blade was using the chaos to gather intelligence of his own. One of his top lieutenants, Knox, had overheard something through the vent system. Alvarez ain't working alone. And that changed everything. The mole wasn't a lone corrupt officer. It was bigger, deeper, more dangerous. A network. A pipeline. A coordinated support system. And T-Blade suddenly realized the most terrifying truth of all. El Diablo wasn't trying to take over Lewisburg. He was preparing for something bigger, something outside these walls. And the SMU was just the testing ground. Lewisburg wasn't the war. Lewisburg was the first battle. Lewisburg was supposed to be a prison that broke the nation's most dangerous inmates. But instead, it became the place where the system itself broke first. The chaos, the killings, the inside mole, the alliances carved from fear. All of it revealed one truth the Bureau of Prisons could no longer ignore. The most violent place in the federal system wasn't violent by accident. It was violent by design. And while the white walls of USP Lewisburg stood tall on the outside, inside those cells, the gangs were already planning their next move. Because for men like T-Blade and El Diablo, the battle didn't end when the doors slammed shut. It only paused, shifted, evolved. And the war they started inside Lewisburg was about to spread far beyond it.